Excellent. Yeah, we're ready when you are.
Great. Well, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. This is actually, well, first I'll start off with I'm Brenna Meneghini. My name is Brenna Meneghini, as I said. I am the team lead over our non-disaster grant programs here in FEMA Region 10. So that is Idaho, Oregon, Washington, and Alaska if you are joining from another region. In our area, we work on the BRIC grants, the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities grants, which you are here to learn about today, as well as the Flood Mitigation Assistance grants. Kayla was actually unable to join us, so we're going to just hop right in, and it'll be mostly me speaking today. Next slide. All right, so if you're here, you're probably familiar with our webinar and schedule, and today is actually our very last webinar on grants management. But all of these will be available online, so if you've missed any, they will be uploaded. Most of them are already uploaded at this point, but as we go throughout the next couple of weeks, the remaining will be uploaded as well. So please do check them out if you have not been able to. Next slide. All right, so here's just some of our normal housekeeping items. So everyone's on mute, but we still welcome your questions. Just go ahead and pop them in the chat box, or you can also use the Q&A feature as well if you prefer. We'll have interactive knowledge checks. Those are all anonymous, so don't feel like we're judging you or grading you. It's just a way for us to help make sure that what we're sharing and the information is coming across well as reiterate some key points to remember. And if you're having any technical issues, go ahead and send a chat directly to the host. You'll see that option where you send to, and then you'll be able to send to a host. Next slide. All right, so today we are going into the BRIC fundamentals and the BRIC grants for how they work, what the BRIC review phase kind of looks like, since once you submit, it can be a little mysterious, and then what's the life cycle of a grant for BRIC, the post-award phase, so after you've received your grant, and then the life of a BRIC grant, that closeout phase. And then we're going to do some resources. We'll have some opportunity for question and answer, but feel free to please put your questions in the chat during the webinar as well, as we're happy to answer them then as well. And then at the end, we're going to have two young women, Laura and Annie, who are going to share with us about AmeriCorps and FEMA Corps opportunities, as they are right now with us in Region 10, working in our Hazard Mitigation Assistance branch. So they are here to share those opportunities at the end for any young adults interested in learning about emergency management and kind of the opportunities that come with AmeriCorps and FEMA Corps. Next slide. All right, so here we're going to go over the fundamentals that we've kind of been talking about the past few webinars. Next slide. Okay, so BRIC is a nationally competitive program. So what that means is that it releases annually on a funding cycle schedule. And so this is done through the Notice of Funding Opportunity, and it releases to grants.gov. And this document basically outlines the bread and butter of the program, when the application period opens, when it closes, deadlines, funding requirements, project requirements. So it's a really important document to always read. It is quite lengthy, but it's a really important document with a lot of the information that you might have a question for. The answer can be found in there. And BRIC is also a newly authorized program, so it replaces the pre-disaster mitigation program, which you may have heard of. And this program was authorized BRIC. It was authorized in 2018 as part of the DRRA, the Disaster Reform and Recovery Act of 2018, Section 1234. And BRIC is also a pass-through grant program. And we'll share a little bit more what that means in the next few slides. So what's the eligibility for BRIC? A federally recognized tribe can apply directly to FEMA as the grant applicant, and it can also apply through their respective state as a sub-applicant. One of the eligibility requirements of BRIC is that a state or a tribe or village applying directly to FEMA must have received a major disaster declaration in the past 7 years. and that can be partially located in or fully located in that state that has had one in 7 years. So basically what this means is, in the past 7 years, has your tribe or the state within that your tribe resides in, have they had a major disaster declaration in the past 7 years? And as of spring 2020, because of COVID, all states and federally recognized tribes meet that criteria. Next slide. All right, so here's our little funding capture slide here, which shows what's available for funding this year. So you can see there's $1 billion available for grants through BRIC this year. And the eligible activities you'll see on your left side, the management costs, capability and capacity building activities. We've had another webinar on that, but those are items like planning activities, building codes, project scoping. And then you'll see at the bottom there, mitigation projects. And you'll see here these in the middle, those set aside and state allocations. And what that means is every state and tribe is eligible for that $1 million allocation or set aside if they meet those minimum requirements. And things like, you know, if you're submitting for a project, you have a hazard mitigation plan, your project's cost effective, things like that. And then we have what's called the National Competition Pool. The far right, you'll see that there. That's $919 million. And this is all for projects. So only management costs and projects can be funded through this national competition, that $919 million. And it can also fund projects up to $50 million federal share. So for example, if you are applying for your set aside and also would like to apply for a large project, you want to make sure that you have a project or other sub-grant activities that fund that up to $1 million federal share. And then let's say you have a larger project that's 23 million federal share. That would go into the national competition pool. So it's really important that you make sure you kind of put those funding opportunities in the right pool so you can maximize the amount of money you're eligible for, that 1 million federal share, and then projects over 1 million would then go into that national competition. Next slide. All right, so what's the cost share of BRIC? So there is a federal cost, or excuse me, a cost share in BRIC that's located in the DRRA and the Stafford Act is amended. So that is the standard cost share for our program is 75 federal, 25 local. And what we say with this is it can't exceed 75%. So if you submit an application and it's 76% federal share and 24% local, we're going to have you adjust it. So it's really important when you're doing those calculations to make sure that it's under 75 or exactly 75. And then you'll see our economically disadvantaged rural communities cost share, what we call the EDRC. If you're familiar with BRIC last year or with the PDM program, this was formerly known as the small and impoverished criteria. So this is a maximum of 90% federal share and 10% local. So similarly to that 75%, it can't be over. So it can't be 91% federal or 92% federal. It would have to be 90% exactly or under. And there is some certain criteria you have to meet to apply for this cost share. And that's you have to be a community of 3,000 or fewer and be economically disadvantaged. And what the NOFO describes this as is having a per capita income of the national level, so the national per capita income, excuse me, of 80% or less. So right now the national per capita income falls around 28,000. So a per capita income in your tribe or village of roughly about 26,000. And this can be a little bit challenging to find. It can take some digging around online, but my tribal census area, if you type that into Google, is very helpful. As well as you can always shoot us an email at our contact at the end of the slide if you're unable to find that. But what to take away from this slide is if you think you're eligible for this 90-10 cost share or your tribe or villages, please put that as the cost share in your application. And the reason why is if you think you're eligible, but you apply for that 75-25, and then the grant selections are made, we can't change that after the fact. So it's important that you request that up front. Next slide. All right, so BRIC can also fund management costs. So what are management costs? Management costs are any expenses that you have in administering the award or sub-award. And it can also include indirect costs. So how it works is there's two ways that you can apply this. So if you're applying for sub-grants, and let's say you're applying for a project scoping sub-grant, the total of that sub-grant for your project scoping, for those actual project scoping activities, can include 5% for management costs, so sub-application management costs. So that would be perhaps things like the person working on the project, the tribal member working on the project, or employee working on the project, reviewing the progress, submitting for a drawdown, things like that. Maybe contractor performance management, items like that. And then there's also the ability to apply for a separate sub-grant for management costs. And this would be sub-grant, or excuse me, management cost, whole management cost sub-grant, and that's 10% of all of your sub-applications. So like you have project scoping and plans, 10% of that you can make as a separate sub-application for grants management costs. And really the most advantageous way is to include 5% of sub-application management costs in each one of your sub-grants, and then also apply for that 10% management cost in a separate application as well. And it's really important here to note that if you're requesting indirect costs, whether it's that 5% in your project application or your project scoping application, or you're applying for indirect cost reimbursement through the grant application, or excuse me, the grant management sub-grant, it's really important to provide a copy of your most recent indirect cost rate agreement. If you don't, it is something we will ask for later on, just because our grants program division does need that to issue the award. But again, if you're not applying for indirect costs, then we don't need a copy of that. So that's the takeaway. Provide it if you have it and are applying for indirect costs. Next slide. All right, so how do our grants actually work? Next slide. So as we were kind of talking about earlier, what a pass-through grant is. What a pass-through grant means is there is a grant applicant, or what we'll also call the recipient. So a grant applicant is a person who applies, right? A state or a tribe, or perhaps an insular area like Puerto Rico or Guam. They are the applicant, and then once they receive the grant, they're the recipient. So that's kind of the language nuance there. If you hear us use those interchangeably, an applicant is before they receive a grant, and a recipient is after they receive that grant. So our pass-through structure works like this. States and federally recognized tribes can be direct applicants. So you can kind of see them here in this middle tier. And that means they work directly to FEMA. So with states, we work directly with states in our programs. And then with tribes, we also can work directly with tribes and maintain that kind of sovereign government-to-government relationship. But states have what they call sub-applicants. So when we award a grant to a state, we award that full grant with all the sub-applications. And then they do contracts to their sub-applicants. So let's say a city or a county, but a tribe could also be this as well. So for example, if you are interested in applying for one of these grants, but perhaps don't want to manage a full grant, just a sub-application or a sub-grant, this would be an opportunity to apply through your state. And the state would still be that grant recipient, and you would be that sub-recipient. So it's kind of passed through in the way that the money is passing through a separate entity before it gets to that, that bottom level who's implementing it. So when you're a tribe coming directly to FEMA, you're essentially both. You are that, that grant recipient and that sub-recipient. Next slide. Okay, so what is the difference of an applicant versus sub-applicant, right? So there's quite a few differences, and it's really important to make the decision, you know, your tribe and your village to make the decision for what's best for you. So applicants apply directly to FEMA. So that date in your NOFO, the Notice of Funding Opportunity, this year, January 28th, that is for applicants. So that means states or federally recognized tribes applying directly to FEMA, they must submit their applications by that deadline. There's also a financial risk assessment prior to award. So what that means is our grants program division is going to go through some certain financial requirements and make sure that your financial systems meet requirements in 2 CFR 200, which is the grant portion of the Code of Federal Regulations. And then if you see at the next portion there, there's also financial desk review during that grant. So our financial team in the grants program division, they'll come and they'll look over your compliance with 2 CFR 200 and ensure you're following proper procurement, things like that. And then you see the quarterly performance and financial reporting. You're going to be submitting that directly to FEMA every quarter, whether you're a state or a federally recognized tribe. That's coming directly to us at FEMA. And then you're also submitting your reimbursement request directly to the FEMA payment system. Applications are due by the end of that application period listed in the NOFO there, like I mentioned, January 28th. Whereas if you see on the state side, kind of at the bottom starting there, the sub-applications are actually due earlier. And the reason why is the state is doing a review to ensure that applications are meeting all requirements and will score well in the national competition. So they are doing their own kind of review before they hit submit at the end of January. So as an applicant, you don't have to go through that, but it's also good to think backing up your dates for your chance to review your own applications as well. Another difference is you would apply through the state. So you're submitting a sub-grant application to your respective state. So let's say you live in Alaska, you would submit your application to the state of Alaska. Any quarterly performance and financial reporting goes to the state. So you update the state on any of your performance, how that's going, any financial issues, things like that. You would work through with the state. And then you would submit reimbursement requests to the state. So they would be giving you those payments. And then there could be any other state requirements. It depends on the state you're located in. For example, a state can choose to prioritize projects, maybe in a certain area or perhaps to disadvantaged communities. So there can be different requirements, but if you're interested in being a sub-applicant, it's really important to reach out to your state hazard mitigation officer. And this person can go ahead and help you either apply as a sub-applicant or provide more details on what that process looks like at the state level. There can be also some it can be a little bit more advantageous sometimes applying as a sub-applicant, and the reason why, it depends on your level of comfort, of course, but the reason why is if you're an applicant, there's very limited ability for FEMA to provide any assistance to you before you submit that application. And the reason why it's nationally competitive. So we're not able to provide anything that's not already existing out in public, essentially, because we can't provide an unfair advantage to a state or a tribe. So because it's nationally competitive, there's limited amount of assistance we can give before that application period ends. But as a sub-applicant, that state can really work with you. So let's say you're having issues with your benefit cost analysis, or you're not sure if a project's eligible, the state would be the one to work with you to ensure that your BCA is correct or that your project is eligible. And they can provide that more hands-on technical assistance because they're not involving FEMA employees who are unable to give that because of the competitive nature. Next slide. But what to take away from that slide is there is different management requirements depending on what you choose to be an applicant or a sub-applicant. There's no right or wrong answer. It's really up to your tribe or village. Thanks for dealing with me, Michelle. Next slide. So here's the grant management cycle. So it's, you see this NOFO, you hear the end of the deadline, the end of the application period. So what is all that about? So basically right here you'll see that funding opportunity, the notice of funding opportunity is going to release. That's going to release, as we mentioned earlier, to grants.gov. And so that kind of starts that annual funding cycle. So then the application period will close in FEMA Go. In the middle here, you're probably working on your application, but that ends there, or that middle, the application period will close in FEMA Go. And then your application goes through several different reviews. It goes through a programmatic review, a technical review, an environmental and historic preservation review. And then from here, it goes through a request for information phase. And this is when we are preparing your grant for award, but perhaps, so your grant had been selected at this point, but perhaps there's some forms missing or there's something that's slightly ineligible in your scope of work that needs to be removed. For example, a common one I see in our hazard mitigation plan scopes of work is for human-caused disasters. For example, civil disturbance, cyber disruption, things like that. So we could identify that and say, hey, we're unable to pay for non-natural hazards in our grants, so you can include that in your hazard mitigation plan, but please note it's not allowable grant expense. So that would be an example of a request for information. That's when we're working directly with you as the grant applicant to prepare your grant for award and make sure all your sub-grants meet our criteria. Then here, we work kind of behind the scenes and we do a financial commitment, and we work with our GPD, which is our Grants Program Division, and they issue that award to you. And then we'll see a little bit later, but you'll also sign some grant paperwork and attesting to the terms and conditions. And then the next is actual grant implementation. So you're administering those sub-grant activities. So let's say maybe you had a project scoping and then an update to a hazard mitigation plan. You'd actually be implementing those activities. And then you're also doing your quarterly reports because those are required. And so you'd be submitting and doing those, and then monitoring. Make sure your sub-grant and the work that you said you were going to complete is actually occurring. And then we have the very last thing here, the sub-grant and grant closeout. And we'll go more in details at the end about this. Next slide. All right, so our first knowledge check. Let's see here. Up on your screen, you should have a poll, and it should say, please read the 4 statements below on BRIC, eligibility, and identify which is false. All right, so which one here is false? A federally recognized tribe can be the applicant and sub-applicant. B, a federally recognized tribe can be a sub-applicant to the respective state. C, tribe or village or the state located in must have received a major disaster declaration in the past 7 years. Or D, can only be fully located in a state that has had one in the past 7 years. So a tribe or village can only be located in a state that has had one in the past 7 years. Remember, which is false? So go ahead and select which one you think is false. Great. Okay, so most people here did answer D, can only be fully located in a state that has had one in the past 7 years. And that is false because your tribe or village can be partially located in one as well. So for example, if your tribe or village borderlines 2 states and falls within 2 states, so I'm just going to give a random example here. Let's say Montana and Idaho. And Idaho's had a disaster declaration in the past 7 years, while Montana has not. You could qualify for that because Idaho has. So this is wrong because you can be partially located in a state. All right, great job, everyone.
Brenna, would you like me to read out this question for you that came into the Q&A?
Oh, let's take a look. Let's see here. Okay, so the question is, I need to clarify that an indirect cost is only eligible to be reimbursed if you stipulate that that is what you're using management costs for. That's a good question. So when you do your cost estimate, so for example, if you're submitting a sub-grant for management costs and you're developing your cost estimate, you would have to articulate what those management costs are for. So whether it's common one we'll see is personnel, so perhaps your staff time to doing quarterly reporting, drawdowns, managing contracts, things like that. Or you could also list things as indirect costs. But yes, you would have to explicitly make sure that that's in the budget. So for example, if you submit a management cost sub-grant or include that 5% in a project or project scoping application, you would want to make sure if you're using that for indirect, you have indirect listed. Otherwise, it's not an eligible expense because it wasn't a part of the budget. So that's a good question because you want to make sure it's captured in your cost estimate. One of the scenarios I tend to see, actually is, so here's a good example of this, is, so let's say we're looking at a hazard mitigation plan update, and a state, or excuse me, and the budget is 100% contractual. And then in the cost share portion, a letter is provided saying that tribal staff time will be used as match. That's something we've worked through in an RFI, or perhaps they said maybe indirect would be partially used as match. So 5%, things like that. And that's somewhere where we see a discrepancy, right? Because your budget would have to account for the whole grant. So the budget in that cost estimate has to account for the whole grant, not just the federal portion. So if you wanted to use, 5% of your grant and that sub-applicant management cost as indirect, but also use that as towards your match, that would need to be listed in the budget. And the budget couldn't just be like 100% contractual, because you would need to include your match. I see one other question here. Do all state sub-applicants need to be approved for funding for the state application to be approved for as a whole? No. So let's, for example, if the state of Idaho applies for 6 sub-grants, and through the competitive review phase, it's found maybe 2 sub-applications are eligible and selected. Those 2 would then move on. It wouldn't just be like a yes or no. The state had one ineligible project or one that didn't get competitively selected, and so the whole thing isn't selected. No, it's selected per sub-grant. So when it's not a yes or no at the grant level, it's a yes or no at the sub-grant level. So for example, if you were a tribe and you were applying as a sub-applicant to the state, and you're concerned that maybe other sub-applications with the state won't do well, and that means you won't do well, no, your sub-application is reviewed, so that wouldn't impact you. All right, next slide. All right, so now we're talking about the review phase. So you submit your application on January 28th this year, and you're like, where does it go? Well, it goes through several different phases. So first it comes to us here in the region, and we do a really basic review. This is to make sure, for example, like if you're applying for a project, that you have an eligible mitigation plan. So a lot of it is very basic, that you have a scope of work, that there is an eligible activity, and that you have a hazard mitigation plan, things like that. And then it goes through headquarters, and it goes up and does our technical review as well as the competitive review, depending on what the application is for, so what sub-grant it is, if it falls into the national competition or if it doesn't. But this is also the time when that technical review is done, and that's when, for example, if you're doing a project, your project is reviewed at the National Technical Review Panel to ensure it's not only technically feasible, but the benefit cost analysis you provided is correct, and that there is a positive benefit cost ratio. So if you're doing a project, the benefit cost analysis is a really important portion, and this is where they would rerun your BCA, your benefit cost analysis, to ensure that they are also getting the number that you put in. So that's just a little teaser to say your BCA is really important for projects. So make sure when you're creating a BCA, you're also ensuring that any numbers you put in, you have documents for, and some kind of documentation to show why you put in that number. So for example, if you said, we're doing an infrastructure retrofit and this power has, goes out once a year for 20 days, you can provide some type of documentation to show that, whether it's a snapshot from your public works that shows that, things like that. So then after selections, your project goes down to us, or your project or other applications, and it goes through that environmental and historic preservation review. And the only items that don't go through this is through planning, so hazard mitigation plans. If you're doing a plan or a plan update, this is the only portion that would not apply. But if you're doing project scoping or a project, this is something that would still occur. And this is because our environmental and historic preservation, they do have to make sure that they're complying with federal laws, such as NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act. So this is when your project would also go through that. And then through concurrently here, you're going to go through that request for information phase. That's when our reviewers here in the region and your hazard mitigation assistance specialist will be reviewing your application and getting it ready for award. And then you can see here we move to the second to last bullet where your application would move to our GPD, our Grants Program Division, and you would go through that financial risk assessment, you fill out a form and return it, and then our FEMA GPD Grants Division, they make that grant award. Next slide. Okay, so here's a little bit more of the breakdown of what that looks like. So the review happens at the regional level and headquarters level for our competitive program. So as I mentioned there, that regional initial review is done, and that's to make sure that you have an eligible sub-grant and an eligible sub-grant activity, and your application's complete. And then it goes on to the national technical review. So they can either be denied or sent to selection. So this would be for projects. So for example, if you're doing a project and you've submitted a BCA and you submit a BCA of like 7, let's say 7-to-1 is what the ratio would be. And NTR looks at your benefit cost analysis and they rerun it, and they're not able to find any documentation you provided to show how you came up with those figures, and so they find the project's not cost effective. That is when NTR would find it. We would get a memo from our national technical review saying that the project's not cost effective. Or it could be cost effective, and hopefully that BCA was great and it would be sent on to the selection process. So selections for further review, this is what you'll see when we email out in the summer about this. It's called Selected for Further Review. And these are announced by FEMA headquarters and they are listed on FEMA's website. These are subgrants that are basically selected for further review. What that means is they are now being sent to the regional offices to review for completion. So that's when they come to us. So then that's where we move to this red portion here. So this is late summer time frame usually, is when we start our regional detailed programmatic review. And then concurrently, at the same time, our environmental and historic preservation team would be reviewing as well to make sure that the project would meet their requirements. So that's why you may see an RFI, request for information, that has items that are programmatic, like please amend this language in your scope of work, or perhaps please attach the SF424A, the non-construction budget form. Then you may see something that's an RFI, a request for information from that EHP specialist. And so finally there you'll see that request for information process, and that's kind of what I was just speaking about. That's when our HMA specialists, they're reviewing your applications and they're going to send you an RFI for any information that they need to complete that review and move your sub-grant and grant to award. So as you'll see that note there, that can include RFIs from HMA, our Hazard Mitigation Assistance Program, EHP, Environmental Historic Preservation, or NTR. So we say NTR here, the National Technical Review. So for example, if you have a project and NTR thinks it's feasible, but they've made a few comments. For example, please provide documentation of power loss if you didn't provide that, right? So that would be something that we can include in an RFI. Or perhaps please confirm that the project would be built to ASCE, whatever number. Those are certain items that we would get from NTR as an RFI. So then the the RFI process, that request for information process, is listed in the 2015 HMA guidance, which is one of our main policy guidance documents. So what this allows is 30 days from receiving that RFI from your HMA specialist to answering that RFI, saves 30 days. And then if we don't hear back from you, you'll have an additional 15 days to follow up. So it's really important to try to comply with these numbers. And the reason why is we really do work with a lot of applicants. And if you don't reply for 6 months, it's really just going to slow the review and slow down your grant award, because at 6 months, and we're not hearing back from you, we're having to work on other applications as well. So it's, we can't drop everything and work on that as soon as you respond, 6 months later. So it's really important to try to follow that 30-day and 50-day or 15-day follow-up. And what I like to share here is too, we're not trying to hold your hands to any fire. If there's some reason you can't meet that deadline, just let us know. Sometimes you might need additional time. But again, if you can, make sure that you're communicating that to your program reviewer. Next slide. All right, so what's the financial risk assessment? So after your applications move from our program review, it goes to our grants program division. And prior to an award, they're required to evaluate an applicant, so right, not a sub-applicant, so you're coming directly to the federal government here, level of risk for managing funds for federally funded activities. And this is actually specifically in the 2015 HMA guidance too, if you'd like more details about it. But the form is called Accounting System and Financial Capability Pre-Award Risk Assessment. And what it does is basically collects information for our grants program division on your internal control procedures to meet requirements of the grants management regulations listed in 2 CFR 200. And that your accounting system can track federal funds and non-federal funds, right? So that the funds aren't being commingled. For example, they're all not commingling in one area. You're able to track what is being spent from that actual grant. And so this form is actually sent directly from our grants program division once we complete our reviews. So that is when you will hear from them. So it's really important too that your applicant, so if you're a federally recognized tribe coming in directly to FEMA, that your applicant POC and FEMA Go, your point of contact, is up to date. Because if it's not, let's say there's some staff turnover or perhaps a new administrator is taking over and the old one was the main point of contact, the grants program division is going to send that, and the person responsible for responding and doing the paperwork is that point of contact. So it's really important that if that person has changed, that you update that in the system, because then it may not get to you. So really important that that's up to date. Next slide. All right, so now we're moving on to FEMA approval and award. So after you fill out that form from our grants program division, the assistance officer in our grants program division, they'll work with you if there's any additional information they need based on how you filled that form out. Perhaps they, you noted something that they have more questions about, so they'd follow up with you. But assuming that there's nothing, they will go into award, they're going to start the award paperwork. And this award paperwork is going to show your grant number, the sub-grant numbers, because those are different than the grant number, the federal share for each of your applications, the local match, and then the overall total for each sub-grant. And this paperwork requires a signature accepting the award and terms and conditions, and it has to be returned. And so this is really important because there have been a few times we haven't had this returned, or at least for a while. So it's really important that you return this because that's when your grant is essentially active and you can now begin work if that period performance has started, but it does require that signature. So make sure you're prepared to have that signatory from your tribe or village to sign and accept those terms and conditions of the award. And then lastly, that award paperwork is also going to include instructions on how to register for the payment system. And this is really important because if you don't register for the payment system, you're not able to do your financial drawdowns of the funding, right? So it's really important to read that, but in general, it's also really important just to read your terms and conditions of the grant because you also want to know, right, what are your requirements. It also covers things such as, that you will be submitting quarterly reports, things like that. Next slide. All right, next, knowledge checks. All right, so FEMA will conduct a risk assessment to determine all of the following, except A, the recipient's internal procedures meet requirements of 2 CFR 200, which is the financial management portion, or B, the financial responsibility of the recipient to adequately manage the funds for federally funded activities, C, how many other federal awards the recipient has or has had in the past, or D, the recipient's accounting system used can properly track federal and non-federal funds. All right, so remember, it's with this risk assessment is done to determine all of the following except, so which one of those is not correct? So go ahead and choose your answers.
Looks like we have a couple people just finishing up.
Great. No worries, it gives me a little bit extra time to sip my tea. All right, looks like ended. We'll get some answers here. All right, so most people answered correctly. The answer is C, how many other federal awards the recipient has or hasn't had in the past. That's correct. The financial risk assessment form does not ask that. It's not trying to figure out how many other federal awards your grant or your tribe or village has had. So the risk assessment does not cover that. All right, next slide. All right, so the life cycle of BRIC grant and post-award. So this is after you've signed that award paperwork, you're moving on to those actual activities. Next slide. All right, so here, this is kind of our always moving circle, right? All of these are essentially occurring at the same time. So you're going to be ongoing, you're going to monitor your project ongoing, right? And I say project, I also mean plan, project scoping, items like that. So whatever your sub-grant activity is, you're going to be monitoring and make sure that the work's occurring in the schedule, and that it's moving along. And then perhaps you're procuring and you're following procurement regulations and maybe hiring for a contractor or perhaps a consultant for a very specific thing like a risk assessment, or perhaps you're procuring a company to build and construct whatever your project is. And then also here you'll see that financial desk review, because that's going to occur sometime in your grant. There's not a specific period of when that occurs. It really works with our grants program division and their schedules. So just knowing that kind of is in that post-award phase. And then quarterly reports, right? Those are due every quarter, the fiscal year quarters. And so those you're going to be filling out and submitting. And then changes or modifications. If there's anything you need changed to your sub-grant, perhaps your cost estimate's no longer correct and you need a budget amendment, that's how that would be done. And we'll go into that a little bit here. Next slide. So first we have procurement. So all applicants, so right, remember that's the state and federally recognized tribes, and sub-applicants and non-federal entities, they have to follow procurement requirements under the regulations of 2 CFR 200. And procurement includes the selection, award, and administration of contracts. This policy here on our right is a job aid that we provide quite frequently that just covers some of our basic procurement in our hazard mitigation assistance programs. However, all of these items really mentioned in it are part of 2 CFR 200. And if you'd like a copy of this, we're always happy to provide that, or you could just search it and it also comes up. Next slide. So procurement. So federally recognized tribes, they have to follow 2 CFR sections 200.318 through 326. So this is really important. And why we like to highlight this is because during your financial desk review, this will be looked at. So it's important that you're following these regulations. The two more procurement items that we like to highlight because we run into questions with them the most is the conflict of interest policy and an unfair advantage policy. And we'll kind of discuss this here now. So first, you want to make sure that you have procedures in place to ensure there's no employee or perhaps organizational conflict of interest in a procurement action. So for example, you know, some type of conflict of interest in maybe perhaps there's a contract going out and it's, you know, the tribal employee who's working on the subgrant and now they're awarding the contract to their own company, their own private company they own. So you want to make sure that you have a strong conflict of interest policy in place. And then one of the ones that we see most frequently is an unfair advantage. And what this means is contractors, and this is in our procurement guidance as well as 2 CFR 200, excuse me, contractors that develop or draft designs, plans, specifications, statements of work, and invitations for bid or requests for proposals must be excluded from competing once that grant is awarded. So what this means, one of the scenarios that we see quite frequently is, for example, a contractor writing a scope of work for a tribe, village, or state, and then expecting to receive that contract after the grant. So let's say it's for hazard mitigation plan. They write their scope of work for you, or the scope of work for the grant. You submit that application, and then they expect to receive the awarded funding and that awarded contract from you to write your hazard mitigation plan. That's not eligible under 2 CFR 200 because they already had that unfair advantage of developing that scope of work for you. So it's really important that you take a close look at this policy and 2 CFR 200 to make sure that there's no conflict of interest happening there and that you're not getting unfair competitive advantages. Because again, this is going to be looked at in your financial desk review. Next slide. And actually, I do want to add one more comment to the next slide, or excuse me, to this previous slide, and that is why it's important that you comply with this. It's a term and condition in your grant award that you comply with 2 CFR 200. So when you sign that, you are stating you will comply with it. But when you do your financial desk review as well with our grants program division, they're going to be ensuring that you are adhering to these requirements in 2 CFR 200. And that's important because let's say that contractor in that scenario I gave as an example, they ended up working on that scope of work, you get the grant, and then they are awarded the contract. Those funds could be potentially disallowable costs, excuse me, because that was not procured under 2 CFR 200. So here we have another question in the chat that pertains to this. So they can't submit a bid. Yes, correct. It depends on, so it depends. In that example I give, right, that they developed that scope of work, and then post-award you get the grant, and then you put out a competitive, RFP or request for proposal, and then they bid. Yes, they cannot bid on that because as our 2 CFR 200 states and the procurement guidance states, they have to be excluded from competing because they have that unfair advantage. Next slide. All right, so there's more to procurement than, just that scenario I gave. There's also a really hefty portion in 2 CFR 200 under 200.320, which gives the methods of procurement that are allowed. And these are procurement by micro purchases, the small purchase procedures, sealed bids, competitive proposal, and non-competitive proposal. And In reality, this is something we don't work closely with in our section because this is really handled by our grants program division when they do their financial desk review. But a really good, a really good thing to keep in mind is if you really have a question about this and are concerned that, you might not be following 2 CFR 200 if you move forward with a procurement action, we're always happy to answer that, and our grants program division is as well. So it's a great great idea to email in if you have any questions. And there's also listed here in these links. There's also we have also training specifically for procurement under grants, and this is a team nationally at our headquarters that does trainings. They do webinars, and they also are available to do like kind of one-on-one training specifically for your tribe or village, depending on what you need. So this is a really great resource if you're kind of beginning in that procurement process or have questions in procurement and want to make sure that your tribe or village has strong procurement requirements. And then there's also this link here for more training on contracting with federal funds for goods or services before, during, and after disasters. Next slide. All right, so your monitoring desk review. Sometimes I also call this financial desk review, so you got a little bit confused there in my wording, that's why. It's the monitoring desk review. So what's this versus the financial risk assessment? That risk assessment is just a form, I believe it's 2 or 3 pages, and it's pre-award. So this is just to have you fill out and confirm certain things that your financial system can monitor and keep track of a federal grant. And then the monitoring desk review occurs during that award. And the purpose of that desk review is to provide guidance and recommendations to enhance your management of that federal grant funding. So for example, our grants program division is going to walk through test compliances for property standards, procurement standards, as you see there is your screen, and they're also going to provide recommendations if any are needed. This is a really common one of where procurement issues would be found, so that's why it's a great idea to look into the procurement requirements in 2 CFR 200 prior to doing anything, because you could prevent that finding later. And if there is a finding in that monitoring desk review, they're going to provide recommendations to strengthen that and how to fix that so you comply with the grant requirements. Next slide. Okay, so ongoing monitoring. So after your grant's awarded, right, your grant or sub-grant, your tribal representative or recipient is required to monitor and evaluate that progress. So because, like in this example, that we're talking about as a tribe, as a direct recipient to the grant, that tribal POC is required to monitor and evaluate the progress of that activity. So the monitoring should include things like making sure that approved scope of work and budget is being completed in accordance with how it was awarded. You're going to monitor any programmatic and financial progress. So maybe, schedule changes are needed. Maybe if you're moving a little bit slower than you thought, or maybe you aren't. Maybe you're moving ahead of time, that you're drawing down funds appropriately, things like that. And then that POC is also going to be ensuring that administrative requirements in that financial portion of 2 CFR 200 are being followed, so any procurement actions. And then they're monitoring grant terms and conditions. An example of this would be if you're doing a project and you have an environmental and historic conditions on your grant. For example, one of the common ones we see here is like an activity couldn't be done during the flood season as determined by a local floodplain administrator. So for example, that you're complying with that to ensure that your work or whatever construction work that project was is not during that flood season. And then that point of contact is also going to be the one to follow up on any deficiencies that are discovered through any audits or on-site reviews, like your monitoring review and your quarterly reporting and just any other monitoring activity. So for example, if your quarterly reporting maybe has a sentence and doesn't give your FEMA reviewer enough details to where the project actually is, our HMA specialist who works on your grant would follow up and request some more details, and that's an example of when they would reach out to the tribal recipient and POC to make sure that that activity is being done. All right, next slide. Okay, quarterly reporting. So quarterly reports, this is one of our most asked about things and most kind of surprising things is after a tribe or village gets award. Yes, there is quarterly reports. You are required to submit 2 quarterly reports, and these are every quarter for the fiscal year. So for example, the last quarter, quarter 4 of fiscal year 21 ended at the end of September, and our quarterly reports will be due 30 days after, so they're due by the end of October for that fiscal year 21, quarter 4. So there are 2 forms, and this first one is the Federal Financial Report, SF425, and this is filled out in the financial system where you are drawing down the funds, and then the standard form for performance progress, and this is the PPR form. And these will highlight things like status of cost, so an amount of money you've drawn down, any problems or concerns or delays for your projects or subgrants, significant activity and developments. So we want to see that progress is being made, right? That the grant's actually being drawn down, they're doing the work that the scope of work said it was going to be done, things are moving along. And then you can also check out our 2015 HMA guidance, which really lists more into the quarterly reporting requirements and what specifically is required for a quarterly report. And then lastly here, you'll see we do review your quarterly reports, and we will send RFIs, a request for information, if we need to. For example, like I gave that example of just one sentence, sometimes, if there's not enough information, such as grants going great. Well, we don't know what that means. So we need to make sure that the scope of work is being completed and that progress is being made. So that's an example of when our specialists would follow up with you for an RFI and see if they could get more details on the progress. Next slide. Okay, post-award.
Oh, sorry, Brenna, there's a question on, does this mean that the PPR only, or would it include PPRE also in the Q&A?
That's a great question, David. The PPR and the PPRE, and we also have some regional guidance we send out on the quarterly report that we can go ahead and send to you as well. The PPR is just a general narrative, and the PPR gives more of a task to budget. So let's say in your narrative, you're saying, we're going out for bid for our procurement of a contractor, waiting to review proposals, started steering committee or formed steering committee, had first meeting. And then in the E, that's where the PPRE, that's where you're going to link it to those costs. So show how much you spent for those activities. So for example, developing steering committee, having first meeting, $2,000, things like that. So you're going to link it to what you actually drew down in the FFR. All right, so now we have post-award changes and modifications. So there is ongoing monitoring, as we've been discussing, that you're monitoring to make sure your grant and subgrants are in compliance with the approved scope of work and budget. And sometimes there's a need to make a change or modification. So sometimes you are required to get approval for this. It's really important, first and foremost, for scopes of work. If you're changing anything to your scope of work, that you are getting a FEMA written approval before that. That's a pretty hard stop there. You want to make sure that you're getting approval if you're changing your scope of work. And then another example would be like if you have a non-construction sub-award adjustment. Let's say your subgrants for $150,000 to write a hazard mitigation plan, and it's for 130,000 federal shares. So it's over that $100,000 line, and you want to take, let's say you want to take $40,000 from personnel and move it to a contractor. That would require prior FEMA written approval. So you want to make sure if you are making budget changes that you are getting that written approval. And You can find more information on that specifically for prior approval for budget changes in 2 CFR section 200.308. But also, if you just aren't sure and feel a little bit uncomfortable, moving forward, it's a great idea to reach out to your grant, or excuse me, your HMA specialist who works on your grant, and ask them if that approval is needed before you move through with it, because they'd be happy to let you know. Next slide. All right, so here's some more examples. Like, let's say you have some personnel costs in pre-award. So you thought you were going to expend more money than you did writing and developing that application. And so now you'd like to rebudget that and move it to a post-award personnel category. Because now, you're post-award, they're actually writing that hazard mitigation plan. You could use that funding in actually the personnel post-award category. So that's an example of where you'd want to confirm with FEMA that that's eligible and receive that approval. Another example would be adding a community to your planning scope of work that wasn't originally in the scope of work. So let's say an example for a federally recognized tribe would be like, you were going to write your hazard mitigation plan, your scope of work was for that, and then, a few months in, you found out you're going to actually have a multi-jurisdictional plan, and you're going to partner with the city next to you, and it's going to be a tribal and city multi-jurisdictional plan. That is something that we want to make sure that is added to your scope of work and approved, so you'd want to make sure that's FEMA approved. And as Kayla noted right here in the slides too, and I hopefully covered just in the last slide, if you don't know about your budget change or your scope of work and you don't know if it requires pre-approval, it's best just to ask the HMA specialist for your grant, because that way you know for sure and you can feel comfortable moving forward in getting that pre-approval, or perhaps you don't need it. Next slide. All right, so the period of performance. So the period of performance for BRIC grant starts with the acceptance of the award and ends no later than 36 months. So that means when you sign that paperwork, there's going to be a date in that award letter for the period of performance, and it's going to be one date to one date, and that's the 36-month period of performance frame. It's new for BRIC. You can submit a request for a longer period of performance in the application, but you want to make sure that's in your application and includes justification. So for example, maybe you had actually a really complex project and you don't think you can get it done in 36 months. You can request more time, but it has to be that application. It has to include justification. So if you think that's the case, it's important to request that in your application. And then there's also grant extensions. So we can extend your period of performance, but they're not automatically approved. So it's really important that if you think you're going to need a grant extension, that you're making that extension request within 90 days. So at least 90 days prior to that grant grant expiration and the end of your POP, you are submitting to FEMA why you need that extension and the proposed date. So for example, let's say my period of performance for my grant ends on 12/1/2021, so this December. But I think I need, 8 more months, and the reason why is our tribal administrator, who is assisting in writing the grant, actually fell ill. We had to hire a new tribal administrator, and then some of the steering committee members got COVID and no longer could participate, so we're not as far along as our plan as we thought. That's an example of what you would want to submit to FEMA and let us know. So maybe in that example, I would request 10 months extension for the grant, items like that. We also do have a regional handout we give out for how to request an extension. So if our contact at the end, you're welcome to shoot us an email and we'll provide that as well. But it's really important to request this within 90 days if I can really get that across. Because what we can't do is, let's say your grant period of performance ended, let's say it ended August 30th. And then you call me today and say, hey, Brenna, I need a grant extension. It's not possible anymore. Your grant period of performance has expired and your liquidation period is almost closed. And we'll go into what a liquidation period means. So it's really important to make sure you are monitoring that grant actively, right? And thinking, you're ahead of that, POP, you're monitoring it, seeing your progress. Maybe you're not as far along as you thought you'd be, and you're thinking, yeah, I just need that grant extension. And so it's really important to request that prior to that period of performance ending. And the last note there is it extends the whole grant. So for example, if you are coming directly to FEMA and you have that whole grant and you have, let's say, 5 sub-grants within it, but you know, you're really focused on one, that plan example, right? You're really needing that plan to be extended. We're going to need to know the status of all the sub-grants because we're extending that whole grant. So we want to make sure that we know what is being extended and why. So for example, if you're requesting your grant to be extended and it's only for that hazard mitigation plan, the rest of the 4 sub-grants are going to be completed. That's something you could report out in your request is, you know, these other 4 sub-grants are on track to be completed and won't need the additional time, but the one that needs additional time is this plan because so-and-so. Next slide. All right, so our knowledge check. All right, so a contractor here, contractor A, wrote the statement of work and designed a project submitted. The project was selected. Can contractor A bid on the request for proposal and be granted the project work? A for yes or B for no? So they wrote that statement of work and they designed the project for you. Can they bid on that request for proposal? All right, so here we have contractor A wrote that statement of work and designed the project. The project was selected. Can contractor A bid on that proposal and be granted the work? The answer is no, and right, because they have that unfair advantage in 2 CFR 200 that's listed, and they can't be granted that work because they have an unfair advantage. So they must be excluded from those requests, or they must be excluded from the competitive selection in that procurement process. All right, next slide. All right, so then we're moving on in the life cycle of the BRIC grant, and we're moving on to closeout. Next slide. All right, so as you work through your grant, you finish your activities, you will notice in your terms and conditions, you're required to submit a closeout. And what this means, if you're a federally recognized tribe or state, so basically you're the recipient, the grant recipient here, not the sub-grant recipient, right? You are required to submit sub-grant closeout packages for every sub-grant as well as a grant closeout package. So the sub-grant closeout, for example, let's say you have a hazard mitigation plan, and then you have management costs, and maybe a project scoping. You would submit a letter and kind of report on each of those, and then you would also submit a letter for your grant closeout requesting that grant be totally closed as well. Because remember here, we're in the sub-grant, we're monitoring and reviewing that specific sub-grant, that awarded scope of work, so you are going to have to report out on that specific sub-grant, not just the grant as a whole. Next slide. All right, so final reports. So the final reports are required to be submitted when all of your administrative actions and work has been completed for that activity, so your sub-grant work. It can be submitted prior to the period of performance. So for example, if your scope of work has been completed prior, and note there's a little error there, completed prior to that, that period of performance end date, you can submit that closeout package. And then you'll see here, as a recipient, you're required to submit an SF-425 and performance report no later than 90 days after that period of period of performance, excuse me. The SF425 is the financial FFR, your final financial report, and then your final performance report. And then included in this is your, they must be included with your closeout package for the grant or sub-grant. And there's really specific award and sub-grant closeout requirements. So I really encourage everyone to read the HMA guidance portion on that because it lists what specifically that you're going to need to report out on. Next slide. So what is a sub-grant closeout versus that grant closeout, right? So you're reporting out on that sub-grant and that specific activity that's being completed and requesting closeout of all your sub-grants and each one individually. So you're sending a sub-grant closeout letter and all closeout supporting documentation. And this can vary. I'm so sorry. I have a senior dog and she's making some very loud noises, so hopefully no one can hear that.
I don't think anyone minds, Brenna. We love dogs.
Yes, my sweet girl is 14 and a half. So you're required to submit those sub-grant closeout request letters and all closeout supporting documentation. And it really depends on what that might be. So for a hazard mitigation plan, for example, you might just submit that FEMA approval of your hazard mitigation plan. Now, if you're doing a project, you're going to need to submit, photos of the project. You're going to need to submit any environmental and historic preservation document showing, that you complied with those conditions. So it's really important to look at the guidance for what specific closeout documentation you might need. And then we'll also review that documentation for compliance, and we'll make sure that we send any RFIs if needed. So for example, if there's any errors in your closeout reports or letters, maybe a figure's off, something like that. In general, though, we say a closeout package should have and should document that your scope of work was fully implemented, photos if it's a project, that all obligated funds were liquidated or spent and consistent with the scope of work. It's okay if they weren't fully spent, but you'll need to report on that as well. All EHP compliance grant conditions were implemented and documented as required. That project implementation was consistent with the federal grant award or sub-grant agreement. And then also you're including your final quarterly financial and performance reports. Okay, so we see here, I have a question, and it's if you submit prior to the end of the POP, do you have only 90 days after submittal? So the 90 days is if you submit prior to the end of the POP, period of performance. So let's say you finish a sub-grant early and you want to submit your closeout package. That's fine. You will submit your closeout package when you're done with all your actions. But if you're going to your full end of your period of performance date, you only have that 90 days after to do your final actions. So your closeout, your sub-grant and grant closeout documents must be sent to us by that 90-day mark, as well as drawing down any final funds and reporting on those. So if you are using that full period of performance, you have 90 days after that period of performance to submit. Next slide. Grant closeout. Okay, so once all your sub-grants are closed, you're required to submit a grant closeout request letter and supporting documentation. So this can be a little bit confusing, but if you're applying directly to FEMA as a grant applicant and recipient, you're required to submit sub-grant and grant closeout packages. And just like that last slide, they're due 90 days after the expiration of the period of performance, and you have to submit all the financial performance and other reports by that period. And it's really important here, this last one, to liquidate all your obligations incurred under the award no later than 90 days after that period of performance expiration. That means you've done all your financial administrative actions for your grant, you've done your final reimbursements, things like that. This is important because let's say you tell us 4 months after the grant period of performance is closed, hey, I can't draw down money, I don't know why. It's because you've passed that 90 days and you should have already completed all your final drawdowns, things like that. The liquidation period, that 90 days is what we call it, the liquidation period, has already been completed and you should have done all your final drawdowns. Next slide. All right, so here's some tips now. So one of the easiest things to help us is to provide good detailed documentation and clearly title it in your closeout package. So for example, you know, if you have a 7-word title and it's not descriptive, it can be hard for the reviewer to ensure and take longer for us to close out your subgrants. You know, you could say, you know, photo 1, photo 2, things like that. That's helpful. And also review the closeout section of the HMA guidance and the HMA addendum for specific project requirements. This is something, you know, our closeout requirement is listed in your grant terms and condition agreement, but it can be easy for people to kind of overlook that. So it's really important that you're active in looking at that closeout section to make sure when your grant period of performance and your work is completed, you're ready to submit those closeout packages. And it's also important that you're telling us that all EHP requirements that were listed, so if you have a project, they've been met and how they've been met. And it can't be a blanket statement. So what that means is you can't say, we met all EHP requirements. We need to know how. So for example, like I gave that that flood example, right, of the project couldn't be constructed during the flood season. So you could say, you know, the project was completed on September 21st, which is outside of the flood season as determined by our floodplain administrator, which you'll see his confirmation in this email, copy and paste below, or something like that. So we want to see that you are, you've complied with the EHP and how you've complied with those requirements, not just saying you have complied with them. Because our EHP team, they also will review your closeout if you had closeout, or excuse me, if you had EHP requirements. So it's also just easier to address those up front. So when they review as well, that they're not having to send us any RFIs, requests for information to send to you. And then a really great tip here is compare your awarded line item budgets to budget actuals. So for example, you can identify any de-obligations needed. So this would be like, let's say you have a $100,000 subgrant, you're reporting out on, you know, your compared budget to what you were approved, and then what was actually spent. And then let's say you had a personnel line item for $20,000 that was approved, and you actually only spent $15,000. So you're going to note there was a $5,000 underrun, and that came from personnel. You didn't spend, excuse me, as much on that personnel as you thought you would. So really providing a side-by-side comparison of actual budget, right, that approved budget, or excuse me, the approved budget, and then the other side of the actual budget that was actually spent. And then if you have a project, providing clear labeled pictures of that project is very helpful. Next slide. All right, I think this is our last knowledge check here. So if a tribal nation is pursuing BRIC as a sub-applicant to a state, when closing out a subgrant, a closeout request letter must be submitted to A, the sub-applicant, or B, the applicant. So right, if you're pursuing BRIC through a sub-application to the state, when you're closing out your subgrant, who is that closeout request letter submitted to? Alrighty here. Let's see if our results will come up soon.
Give me about 10 seconds. It's buffering.
No worries.
I'll share this with you. Are you seeing those results now, Brenna?
All right, now I am. Okay, you're applying as a sub-applicant, right, to the state for BRIC. So you're doing your closeout subgrant letter. Who are you submitting it to? You're submitting it to the applicant. So you wouldn't be submitting it directly to FEMA, you wouldn't be submitting it to the sub-applicant yourself, you're submitting it to the applicant, you're submitting it to the grant recipient, which would be the state in this example. Great job. Looks like we got some all right on that. So here are some key reminders that we went over today. Next slide. So a federally recognized tribe can be the applicant and sub-applicant, or you can be a respective or a sub-applicant to your respective state. That choice is really with you, your tribe or village, and what is important to your tribe or village, and what capability and capacity you feel like you have. So that's really up to you. There's no right or wrong answer. And then here, we'll conduct that programmatic review, right? We talked about that for eligibility, basically. Basic completeness, things like that. There's a technical review, especially for projects, and then an environmental and historic preservation review. And these all occur concurrently at our region. And then applicants will have to submit, so applicants, remember, not sub-applicants here. We're talking about people, tribes or villages or states coming directly to FEMA. They're having to complete that accounting system and financial capability pre-award risk assessment. Next slide. And then if you're awarded a grant, remember these are reimbursement basis grants. So you're not going to go, and let's say that $100,000 grant example, you're not going to draw down that $100,000 all at once. You're going to manage it and pull down those funds as you've spent them and be reimbursed for those. A really important tip is to get ahead of those procurement regulations up front, because those are, we see a common thread, and those seem to be the biggest struggle for all of our grant applicants. So it's really important to review that HMA procurement job aid. And then most changes and modifications after you've been awarded that grant, they require FEMA approval. So make sure that you've taken a look at the 2015 HMA guidance to get a little bit closer look on that, to make sure if you have a change that you're requesting it correctly. And then if you really don't know, reach out to your HMA specialist, because we want to make sure you're successful in your grant as well and you get that approval if necessary. And then quarterly performance and financial reporting is required, and it's good grants management. It's really helpful for us. It's required by the grant. And if you don't submit them, honestly, we're going to email you a lot and ask you to submit them. And another thing is, if we don't hear from you, let's say, months go by and you don't submit quarterly and financial reporting, a grant hold will eventually be put on, which means you won't be able to draw down any funds since you haven't been doing the required reporting. So it's really important to provide that good quarterly performance and financial reporting so your HMA specialist doesn't have any questions. They understand where you are in your grant. Next slide. All right, so resources. Next slide. So FEMA Go resources, we've put the FEMA Go links here. I recently sent out a webinar blast that the FEMA Go team at headquarters had put some new slides up on YouTube that they were walking through for FEMA Go. I'm also going to shoot those out probably again here shortly, but those are available on YouTube. And then there's just general documents and some other helpful tips there on that link. And honestly, at the region, we're not experts in FEMA Go. And the reason why is it's relatively new, and we also see different sides of the system. So we see, the FEMA reviewer side, and we see that applicant level side. So if you have a really challenging question, it's best to email the FEMA Go help desk or call them. And I always recommend, if you're getting an error, to take a screenshot to provide them, because that's the most helpful thing, other than doing a live webinar kind of walkthrough with them, or video sharing. That way they're able to understand your problem completely. Next slide. All right, so there's also a lot of additional resources out there. The top one is for BRIC. It's just the general BRIC webpage. Some information for what good practices before you apply to BRIC, and then some resources for the BRIC program, like our project support materials. I could not emphasize these more. If you're interested in building codes, project scoping, if you're interested in any activity, check out those resources, because there's what we call project support materials. And this, program support materials. PSMs, and they go through all these different categories and sub-grant activity types. We'll talk about general eligibility as well as what to select in FEMA Go. So let's say you want to apply, you're about to apply, and you know, this going to that project support material for your specific type of activity, you'll know how to apply for that in FEMA Go. And then as you're here today, you've probably found our webinars. There's also headquarter webinars, which are available there at that link. And then there is our HMA guidance. We really recommend looking through that because so many answers can be found there. And then our webinars that you're here today joining us on. Next slide. And here is just more of our webinar plugs. You're here, you found it, but these are the webinars we have done if you have not been able to join the other ones. So please do take a look at them if you're able to and view the other ones as needed or interested. Next slide. All right, so today we are also going to have 2 women from the AmeriCorps and FEMA Corps teams here to talk to us about AmeriCorps and specifically as well as FEMA Corps. And basically right now they are with us in our hazard mitigation assistance here in FEMA Region 10, and they're helping us work things like sub-grant closeouts. And so today they're going to tell you a little bit about the program and opportunities, especially for youth in your village or nation who might be interested in getting into emergency management and bringing that knowledge back to your tribe. So I'm going to introduce Annie Sebastiani as well as Laura Hauschlatter, and Laura will take it over first. And Laura, over to you.
Hi, Brenna, thank you. So Annie and I, like Brenna mentioned, are part of FEMA Corps, and so we have been working together with a team of other young adults with Region 10 for these past couple of months on various parts of the hazard mitigation assistance. And so we're just going to talk a little bit about what AmeriCorps and CCC is and how it is super awesome in getting experience in emergency management. So if you could please go to the next slide. So the National Civilian Community Corps has a mission to strengthen communities and develop leaders through team-based national and community service. And FEMA Corps specifically focuses on strengthening communities and developing leaders in emergency management positions. And so next slide, please. So the structure of FEMA Corps is that the team is made up of Corps members like Annie and I, who is led by one team leader, our team leader Sage, who's been awesome and has been working with FEMA Region 10 as well. And we spent 12 months in a professional experience in which members work on disaster preparedness and response projects in administrative capacity. So like Brenna mentioned, Annie and I have been working on sub-grant closeouts for pre-disaster mitigation. Other team members have been working on mapping projects and application review in Region 10, and so you really get exposed to like a really wide variety of FEMA projects and FEMA missions. And then the traditional Corps is more original, rugged, and demanding service experience, maybe more manual labor, but they still gain experience with community service and emergency management. So Annie's going to talk about the next couple of slides.
Okay, thank you. Next slide, please. So AmeriCorps and CCC, this is the traditional, an overall FEMA Corps and traditional is a 10 to 12 month program, and it's full-time residential and national service program for ages 18 to 26-year-old adults, young adults. They travel around the country in teams, helping communities and that need needs and services or emergency management. Team leader specifically, there is no age limit. It's 18 plus, so you can start at 18 years old if you want to be a team leader. Next slide, please. So traditional Corps responds to disasters and rebuilds communities, and they help construct affordable housing, help the environment, plant trees, build trails, remove invasive or unwanted plants, improve camps, city recreational facilities, and schools. So like Laura said, it's a lot more hands-on. So they are mostly the people that help alongside other organizations and Habitat for Humanity, the Red Cross. Next slide.
So FEMA Corps is special because members in FEMA Corps will only work with FEMA throughout the year of service. And so it began in 2012 as a partnership between FEMA and the National Civilian Corps. And it became available because FEMA needed more people to be able to work and accomplish the mission. And so FEMA comes up with projects that they need help with, and then our teams are placed with it. And what's really cool about FEMA Corps is that we're not just like, you know, getting coffee or like doing interning stuff. Like we're doing real work within FEMA and getting to see firsthand how like the federal government works within emergency management. And additionally, FEMA Corps helps prepare you to get a job within FEMA. And so if you are interested in joining FEMA, it's one of the best ways to get involved and get your foot into the door. The FEMA Corps support includes like job preparation, a job fair at the end of the year, and fast-track hiring into FEMA, and opportunities to be exposed to just so many different positions that you could possibly get. Next slide, please.
So these are just some of the benefits and advantages that you can gain from joining this program. Like mentioned, that you're provided lodging, meals, transportation. You are also given an education award that can go towards your student loans. And you also get a living allowance. You get health benefits, loan forbearance, uniform gear, childcare if applicable, and more. And like Laura mentioned, it helps a lot with the resume and job interviewing assistance. You gain a lot of professional experience, and then education and career counseling. Also put your foot in the door as a pathway to a career. You get college credit hours. Some of our members actually haven't gone to college yet, so they're 18 years old and they're going to go after this program. They just took a gap year. So they are going to gain college credits from this year-long program. You also get a lot of certificates in nonprofit management, and you have the opportunity to participate in the Presidential and Congress Awards where you're able to get recognition from the work that you've done. Next slide, please. And this is just like the application cycle. So it breaks down to when to apply for traditional Corps, what to apply for FEMA Corps, and the team leaders positions. And they are listed here where you get the dates to apply, the dates when you do go to serve, and the training or the areas where you're going to be training at. And if there's any more information, if you want to like keep track of the when to apply, you can always go to the AmeriCorps NCCC website or AmeriCorps.gov, and you can just search up FEMA Corps, Traditional Corps, and you can see more information about that. Thank you.
Great, thanks Danny and Laura. We'll go over to the next slide here. And FEMA Corps is a super great opportunity as well. If you have any youth in your village or tribe who are interested in joining FEMA Corps and getting those benefits, but also perhaps coming back to your village with a little bit more experience at that federal level to help kind of either, you know, take on tribal positions or run emergency management in your tribe or village. So we wanted to also share that opportunity with you. So thank you everyone for joining us today. I don't see any additional questions, so you'll see some questions pop up on your screen. Please go ahead and fill those out. And if you have any suggestions for us, please let us know, because we really make these webinars because we want to get as much information to you as possible and also share it in a way that's a little bit more easy to understand. So if there's something that didn't work or it could be better, we really want to know to make it better for you. And then here on your screen, you'll see our email address. These are live people behind it. It's all 5 of us. And when you submit a BRIC application, it's one of us 5 who are actually reviewing your application and working with you to do those requests for information and get your grant to award. So these are the people on our non-disaster team. You'll see Rob there on your left, Cindy, and then myself in the middle, Kayla, and then Robbie. And we are happy to help you and answer any questions of BRIC that you have. I don't see any additional questions, so you know, if anyone has them, please submit some. Otherwise, we also have that general email address, and that's the best way to reach us if you don't have an active grant with us. And the reason why is because we all have a lot of work, and so this way, someone's always assigned to monitor this, and so if you have any questions, it's the best way to get a clear answer. And please keep that email if you have any questions, and we look forward to seeing what kind of applications we get for BRIC this year. And back to you, Michelle.
Thanks, everyone. So go ahead and take a minute. I'm going to leave that last poll open for just a few, and I'll hold the session too, just in case anyone has any lingering questions. And thank you for joining us today.